Ida is a 2014 film directed by Pavel Pawlikowski about a young nun who, prior to taking her vows, meets her aunt who leads her on a path of self-discovery. The film explores themes of grief, guilt, identity, spirituality, and a general sense of loss surrounding the country's previous occupation by the Nazis and the Soviets during the previous 2 decades. Films like The Pianist focus on the horror of life during the Holocaust, whereas Ida focuses on the underlying horror and remnants of the Holocaust that reside in the coming decades.
With Ida, it is important to know the context behind the film, as it is so important to the narrative. During the 1940s, Poland was invaded by the Nazis and the Soviets, which led to the death of 3 million Jews, 90% of the total in Poland at the time. The Nazis eventually left Poland, but the Soviets stayed and communism rose from the 40s to the 60s, with Stalin's death ultimately starting a depression in Poland prior to the start of the film.
Should we investigate?
Should you shut the fuck up before you get us both killed?
When making Ida, Pavel Pawlikowski wanted to make a film that leans away from the audience and doesn't attempt to emotionally manipulate them through acting, music, or editing. He wanted the characters to feel real and cut out several parts that were in the script, and some that were even shot, that were there purely to explain things to the audience and felt melodramatic.
An example of a scene that was cut was one where Wanda questions a man about the location of her family's killer, and he recognizes her as the notorious Stalinist prosecutor, leaving repercussions for later in the script. This was cut, and instead a scene was shot where Wanda tells Ida about her job when they're in the car. This leads us to the topic of transcendental film. Transcendental film refers to the art of boredom, in which the film leans away from the audience and doesn't lure you in with things like heavy music or notable editing. The film intentionally withholds information from the audience, so as to not hold their hand and to make the moment when certain techniques are finally used all the more gratifying. Paul Schrader states that
these type of films lean away from you, and they use time, and as other people would call it, boredom, as a technique. Eventually, if you're smart enough on how you use these techniques, now you're doing something really rare. You're activating the viewer. And once the viewer starts to move on his own, it's so much more powerful.
The casting is interesting in Ida. Agata Trzebuchowska was a university student, not an actor, and had no intention of starting. Pawlikowski had issues with casting, so asked the Warsaw film community to find actresses, and then, one day he was sitting in a restaurant when he saw Agata. He knew that she was perfect for the role, just by her look and the fact that she was not a professional actor, as Ida didn't need to be. She agreed to star due to being a fan of Pawlikowski's previous film, Summer of Love. Agata Kulesza was the opposite, having performed in Warsaw's dramatic productions for 23 years and having starred in the Polish Academy Award winner Rose in 2011.
the aesthetic in Ida is vastly different to most other films. Rather than the common colour and widescreen, it uses a monochrome and a 1:33 aspect ratio to set the film in the past, as an homage to the film of Pawlikowski's youth in Poland. The film features only diegetic sound from the start of the film up until the final scene to make no attempt to lure the audience in. The framing is also quite irregular, with the shots often featuring lots of empty space, often to signify discomfort and conveying links in spirituality.
A good example of how the performances make the characters feel like real people with real thoughts and feelings is during Wanda's monologue scene in the bedroom with Ida. The interaction between Ida and the drunk Wanda is really revelatory towards how Wanda sees each of them and her own self-destructive behaviour. Agata Kulesza gives a subtle performance when she says that
ten twój Jezus lubił takich ludzi jak ja. Taka Maria Magdalena.
the performance really sells how the character feels about herself and assumes people feel about her. This is interesting as this is actually the first time that Wanda actually admits how she's feeling.
The scene in the forest is another great example of the understated performances in Ida. Adam Shishkovsky's performance as Felix is brief but memorable. Felix seems unpleasant and overly combative when he is first seen, but when the truth is revealed, he appears as vulnerable and weak. This is interesting given that he isn't portrayed as being necessarily villainous or evil in his intentions, and did what he did because he thought it was the moral thing to do in the situation, and dealt with the repercussions and grief of his actions, something all of Poland was going through during this time period.
This scene is an example of how a single shot can be used to create meaning, with Wanda's mere expression conveying how she feels about Ida, and how much Ida reminds her of her sister, whom she misses dearly. It brings a smile to her face, something not seen up until this point. This links perfectly with Pawlikowski's intention to make a film that doesn't explain everything. One where important moments are inferred rather than outright said. It's a refreshing idea and one that I feel ultimately paid off.
And the Oscar goes to... Ida.
Poland, Barbara